He drove the same stretch every night. People called him invisible. He called it knowing the road. By 3 in the morning, the highway belonged to a different kind of city. Sodium lamps thrown like old coins across wet asphalt. The humming of distant cooling towers. The steady heartbeat of his rig. The cab smelled of diesel and coffee gone bitter, of leather softened by years of hands, of the faint antiseptic tang that clung to his jacket from loading docks. A thermos sat in the cup holder, scuffed from 1,000 small jolts. Tucked under the sun visor, a photograph, folded into a neat rectangle, edges worn soft by the way his thumb traced the faces while he waited at stoplights, while he checked his manifests, while the world outside blurred past. He did not think of himself as heroic. He thought of schedules and routes, of tires and margins, of the tiny economies that kept things moving. He liked the solitude. Invisibility, he had learned, made a certain kind of freedom. You could notice things other people missed and not demand anything in return. You could hear the rhythms of night and know when they changed. On that night, the change came as an off note. Rain had been thinning into a fine mist, the kind that smudged light into halos and slicked the white lines into watercolor. His radio muttered static between song requests. His rig's dashboard lit him like a small universe. He had a route that folded through the industrial edge of the city, warehouses, late-night diners, a bridge that smelt like iron and old rain. A mother's voice in the photograph smiled at him from its corner. He kept that smile close. There was a smell before there was anything else, sharp and wrong, the pungent cut of gasoline that does not belong on a normal night, and the metallic reek of overheated brakes. It reached him from a distance, a place where the road split into a curve and then a shallow dip. A light winked where light shouldn't be, then another. 2 vehicles, a smear of headlights angled like surprised eyes. He slowed without thinking, instincts long trained by thousands of miles. Other drivers peeled away or slowed around the commotion. He put the rig into park at the shoulder and killed the engine. The world condensed. Rain, metal, someone's muffled cry. He noticed the small things first. A child's sneaker, half hidden under an overturned seat, white with rain and smudged with the road's gray. A car door that slanted against a guardrail at a wrong angle. A woman leaning over someone, hands pressed to clothing that might be blood. He did not need to name what it might be. He could see the way one man's shoulders trembled as if he were trying to hold himself together by force. He noticed a smell of something hotter than gasoline. He noticed a sound, small, high, a child's cry muffled beneath the rain, the kind of sound that sits in the ribs. He thought for a flicker of the rules. Stay safe. Park at a distance. Wait for professionals.
There were reasons for those rules. Liability, safety, the thin permits that kept independent truckers out of trouble. He had been briefed once, months back, by a supervisor who talked about protocols and paperwork with the gentle insistence of someone who admires neatness over heroics. He had swallowed those words because they were sensible, because they kept his license intact and the company from unnecessary headaches. Then he felt his thumb press against the photograph in his wallet, where his fingers had memorized the texture of the corner. His mother's hands had been small and urgent and perpetually busy, folding shirts, tucking hair behind ears, pressing a coin into his palm for a bus fare or a sandwich. She had taught him in a tone that meant more than guilt, that you were not measured by the applause you earned, but by the things you could not walk away from. See it, she would say, tapping his chest above the photograph. See it, and do what you can. The photograph was always what moved him. Not a grand image, just a blurred backyard, his sister leaning on his shoulder, a dog mid-leap, and his mother's smile like a promise that small things mattered. Tonight, the photograph fit exactly into his palm, a warm weight that steadied him as the rain slid down the windshield in restless lines. He did not calculate. He moved. He moved not as a plan, but as memory and muscle. He grabbed a worn jacket from the back seat and left the cab with the door slamming behind him like a punctuation. Rain beaded on his eyelashes. The highway smelled like a wound. Close up, he could see the small choreography of a crash. Glass glittered on the asphalt. Lights blinked like wounded bees. A child's jacket lay across the hood of a car, half mucked with rain. A truck, smaller than his but still heavy enough to bruise metal, had jackknifed and pressed a sedan into the guardrail. Someone's breath came in uneven noises. He moved toward a door that would not open fully. He wedged his shoulder to the frame, leaned, and found purchase in an angle and a seam and a small sliver of courage. He did not think about how to get the door ajar or what not to do. There was no time for procedural precision. He worked with what he had: height, a long arm, a steady breath borrowed from the rhythms of driving long nights. He saw a face against a headrest, pale in the sodium light, eyes closed, hair plastered to the forehead with rain. There was a child's hand between the seats, fingers curled small as if sleeping. He was aware, in a thin, pointed way, that every movement carried risk. He felt the metal under his palms, cold and forgiving in places, jagged in others. He felt the scrape of something give, and the small, sharp complaint of torn fabric. He heard a man behind him curse, half in fear, half in encouragement.
He knew that professionals would later remind him that scenes like this were unpredictable, that what looked like a door that could be nudged might conceal fractures that made a wrong touch dangerous. He knew, too, that this knowledge could not stand between him and the child who had been breathing shallowly 30 feet away a moment before. He moved the child's small body into his arms. The jacket was damp and heavy, and the child's weight fit strangely into his chest, as if to say, "We survived this far, don't let the thread snap." He held the child close, feeling the fast, fragile beating of a little heart through wet fabric, and the smell of cheap plastic toys and old sugar that hangs to small ones who have traveled too many hours. A stranger's hand rested on his shoulder, a man with a face hard from too many nights like this, and without words they navigated a path away from the tangled wreckage, where lights still sputtered and smoke thinned into the mist. Present tense where the story tightens. Rain hits his face like someone throwing cold water. He keeps moving. Sirens come and recede, a distant rhythm becoming closer like a drum. He lays the child on a blanket someone produced from a trunk. It smells of fabric softener that isn't his, and someone else's urgency. The little chest rises and falls, minuscule, and he breathes with it because breathing in time feels like help. He leans over and presses the wet hair back from the child's forehead, murmuring nothing but the sound of a voice that knows how to count to calm. He feels something raw and tremulous unspool inside him, fear braided with that odd bright thread, relief that swells quick and hot. Then professionals arrive in force. Their uniforms catch the sodium light, and their voices come in clipped, efficient orders. They take over with a competence that feels like a tide washing over a shoreline of small, frantic hands. He steps back because, for all his instincts, there is a respect for the line between citizen intervention and trained response. A paramedic nods at him with a gaze that registers gratitude and a professional reserve. Someone clamps a band over a limb, someone radios for transport. The child's fingers curl around the edge of the blanket like a small flag. He is not the center of the scene, even when he has just done the thing nobody planned for. The scene is too big. Cars, police, cries, the wet map of the highway. People crowd around. Someone offers him a coffee in a styrofoam cup. It is too hot and too small, and he takes it because the act of holding it keeps him feeling human. A reporter's voice, thin through the rain, asks questions that are more noise than curiosity. Someone from the company calls his phone. The screen shows a name he keeps saved as dispatch. He answers because he's used to answering calls, to making reports, to being part of the way things are documented.
The tone shifts here, subtle and quick. The same instinct that calls strangers to risks also invites scrutiny. He finds himself answering questions from an officer who writes with a professional calm. Where were you? What did you see? Did you touch anything? Did you move anyone? He tells the truth as simply as he can. His hands tremble. He can't tell whether the tremble is leftover adrenaline or the fact that the rain has chilled him through his jacket. A supervisor from his company arrives in a rental sedan, face sorted into policy and practice. She asks for his badge number, his manifest, his insurance details. Her mouth forms the phrases he's been briefed on. We need to document everything. There will be an internal review. Please refrain from public comment. They are words shaped by a world that values lines on paper. He hears them and feels two things: a need to cooperate, a thin indignation that here, where the world yawns and spills, paper sometimes feels like an attempt to keep stories tidy by smothering them. The night gives off a new sound, a short, shaky vibration from somewhere near the wreckage. Someone is filming. In a time of phones and fingers, a slit of light on a screen catches the image of him carrying the child, of mud on his boots, of rain shaking off his jacket like a poor benediction. The camera wobbles at the edge as whoever holds it breathes hard. The clip is imperfect and mercilessly intimate. It tilts between the child's face and his hands, and then the uploader frames him in the center. Truck, rain, the slow, unmistakable arc of a man doing what another had not thought possible for a stranger. He does not ask permission to be seen. He had been invisible, remember, part of the city's anonymous machinery. Visibility arrives like a sudden light striking the dirty glass of his life. People clap in the distance, the kind of applause that is half relief, half public declaration. Others murmur. Someone mutters a slant of judgment under their breath. Why did he move the vehicle there? What if he'd made things worse? What did he know about safety? Approbation and suspicion arrive as fast as the rain. They put the child into an ambulance. The doors close with a sigh, rubber and rain pushed against the seal. The ambulance's lights flare blue and red, and then are swallowed by the night. He watches them go, feeling both empty and full at once, like a cup poured too quickly. Later, under an awning where the air is less raw, he sits with his head between his hands and lets the rain run off his jacket. He is tethered by statements and signatures and the checklist of an orderly world, the police taking notes, the company's supervisor insisting on statements, a nurse asking if he needs medical attention. None of that feels like the story he has just lived. Living it is one set of actions. Paperwork is another set. He can hold both, but they are not the same language.
As he answers questions, he keeps returning in his mind to small things. The photograph in his wallet, his mother's hands pressing into his chest, the child's fingers curling around the blanket. He thinks of the thermos still warm in his cab, the scuffed leather of the steering wheel, the way the route had taught him to trust certain sounds. He realizes, with a clarity that is almost painful, that the night will now remember him differently. He imagines people whispering, "That trucker," and he hears both the soft praise and the barely veiled worry in their voices. He is asked to wait at the scene while the police wrap up their duties. The company requests him to come in the morning. They will file an incident report. They will speak to legal. He nods. He understands that the machinery of business must check itself and its people. He also knows that when a citizen steps into a messy human moment, the paperwork often arrives as the first response to control the narrative. The first small public attention arrives the way small things do. A tremor on a phone, a quick chorus of notifications. Someone posts the shaky clip. It moves because it speaks to something people like to see. A stranger stepping into a place fear had pushed most away. It moves because cameras are now the architecture of witness. It moves because his hands lifted in a wet arc with a child held to his chest look like proof that ordinary life is capable of extraordinary things. He does not watch the clip immediately. He does not want to see himself in motion, surrounded by people and flashing lights, and a child's breath between his coat and stomach. He sits instead in the cab waiting area, wrapped in a donated blanket held by a volunteer who smells of coffee and worry, and thinks through the night. The city hums round him, and the rain takes on the steady rhythm of a page being turned. He remembers his mother teaching him to notice things. She had a way of fixing the smallest torn things with immense care, sewing up a button, smoothing the bristle of a broom. Her life had seemed small and stubborn in its acts of attention. Later, when the photograph had been taken in a backyard sun, she had pressed it into his hands like a small instruction manual for living. Look after what's in front of you. He had lived by that instruction without making a religion of it. He had lived it like a mechanic lives by grease, practical, necessary, stained into his skin. Now the photograph felt heavier in his pocket, like a small compass that had pointed him here. People would call him hero. He would admit to the feeling that sometimes, for a breath, the word fit. But he also knew the other side, the mess of consequences that public attention brought. There would be interviews, perhaps, some awkwardness about insurance and liability. There might be gratitude and suspicion braided together in public comment threads. There might be offers of money, or there might be the quiet scolding of officials who believed protocols were designed to keep chaos from becoming lawlessness. He did not want to be a story that simplified the night into a headline. He wanted the night to be kept in its complexity, the sound of a child breathing, a supervisor's clipped voice, a volunteer handing him a blanket, the cold of the rain. He wanted these things to sit in their own right. Late in the night, they bus him to a bench behind a fast food place where a heater throws out hollow warmth. Someone from the company drives past and parks, the windows warming, the person inside avoiding his gaze. He sips the coffee the volunteer offers. It is lukewarm and real. He toys with the idea of going home, of taking the photograph out and holding it again beneath his thumb.
He imagines his mother's face if she knew. Not alarm at his choice, not praise untempered, but that curious, hard, soft look that says, "You did what you should." Before he can leave, a police officer asks for a formal statement anyway. It is standard, she says, in a voice that is neither harsh nor indulgent. She explains protocols. She explains that because he had moved within the scene, they must document his actions. He listens. He tells the truth. Each sentence a small thing given weight. His hands do not stop shaking. An hour crawls past with the speed of freight. Out on the highway, the city rearranges itself. Tow trucks slide away with ruined metal. Traffic resumes in a thin, cautious line. The sodium lamps melt back into their anonymous glow. The ambulance wound down the interstate had already left its scar. The highway held a faint memory of danger, and the city's nightlife had been nudged, momentarily, from its dull repetition. A short, shaky clip arrives in his phone, because someone at the scene posted it with a line of text. Trucker saves child after crash. He scrolls through the night small messages, texts from strangers offering help, numbers from the dispatch asking for details, but he does not click the clip. He feels its presence like a pulse against his pocket. There will be messages of praise. There will be messages of complaint. People will make up a story of him that suits their moods. He thinks about what the photograph taught him. Notice, move, come back. He finds that the instinct to return to the road is as strong as the instinct to keep the child safe. He is a man who has to earn his living with motion. Stillness is a debt he cannot pay. He imagines getting back behind the wheel, the thermos warming his hands, the highway folding itself into manageable lines. But now there is a new weight, being seen. When he finally looks at the clip, it is worse and better than he expects. The camera tilts and shakes, and then finds him. Rain bead splattered face, the child's small head tucked into his coat. His hands are big and muddy and careful.
In the background, the wreck glitters. A woman is calling someone's name. The clip is raw. It does not care about edges. It is the kind of footage that asks the public to be judge and jury in the same moment it offers gratitude. Comments bloom under the upload like spring on concrete. Gratitude spills in heart emojis and short prayers. Someone posts a link to a crowdfunding page for emergency needs. Someone else questions why he had not waited. A columnist writes a curt thread about citizens who intervene and the complications that follow. A local station picks up the clip and runs it between traffic updates and pharmaceutical ads. The clip frays into more clips, shorter edits, captioned versions, commentary layered over his image. Within hours, strangers feel like relatives who know too much. He calls no one famous. He calls a neighbor from his old block who keeps a small diner on the edge of town, because the neighbor's hand will not make too much of it. The neighbor says, "You did right," and that is enough for now. He texts his sister a single sentence, "I'm okay." She replies with a string of praying hands and a photo of their mother asleep in an armchair, the light catching the lines of her face like a map. He puts the phone down. The city around him is both louder and lonelier. Eventually, someone from the company's safety department asks him to come in the morning to give a detailed report. He says he will. They ask about overtime, about the load, about chain of custody for the manifest. He answers like a man who knows the language, but is watching the terms of that language tick off his recent improvised life. He understands their needs. He also understands that the people who write the forms are often trying to protect themselves against ambiguity. At dawn, the rain eases into a light that is almost gray sunlight. A fleet of delivery trucks begins to gather like birds at a feedlot. Drivers stretch and yawn and hand cups of coffee between them. The city wakes, and along the edges the small economies of night begin to collide with the morning shift. Newspapers collapse in racks, morning radio regurgitates the previous night's highlights, and the clip of him is already part of that churn. He thinks ahead, of the way public attention tends to demand heroes or villains, and of his desire to avoid both extremes. He knows the child will be okay. He hopes with a cautious hope that does not speak in absolutes. He hopes the family will find the help they need, and the child's small life will continue with the ordinary miracles of childhood. Scraped knees that heal, a mother who insists on better jackets and earlier bedtimes. He does not know the names of the professionals who took over, and he has no claim on the child's future beyond the memory. He understands dimly that his role in the night is a single stitch in a larger garment. That should be enough. Sometimes he thinks, enough is a heavy, luminous thing.
As dawn stains the horizon, a small cluster of people gather near the open lot where he had parked his rig. They talk quietly, hands drawn into pockets, breath making clouds in the cold. Someone speaks his name, well, the truck's fleet number, the one the company uses to track routes, and someone else looks at him with something like reverence. A local organizer who runs a small fund for night workers approaches him with a coffee in a paper cup, and a look like someone cataloging a potential story and a possible ally. "You did what needed doing," she says. Her voice is careful and warm. "But there are always consequences. We can help." He nods, the way someone nods when they cannot yet sort gratitude from the knowledge that help brings obligations. He remembers being invisible, the relative peace it brought, and sees now the cost of visibility. Being seen will bring praise, but also paperwork, interviews, perhaps a temporary hold on his routes, maybe an internal review. It will also bring people offering help, strangers proposing to start a fund or a meal train for the injured child's family, offers that are sincere and others that are driven by the siren of a good headline. He accepts the coffee more for the human warmth than the liquid. He folds his hands around the cup and feels the warmth seep into his fingers, then into the small muscles of his wrists. He thinks of the little service project he had once dreamed of, a small repair shop by the side of the road where night shift workers could get coffee and a quick patch without having to navigate the daytime bureaucracy. He had imagined it as something modest, a place where men and women who kept the city moving could rest for a minute and be treated with dignity. He pictures it now as something more than a dream, a possibility that might be seeded by the attention his action has drawn. But the attention has a double edge. On the edge of the crowd, a man in a pressed uniform, the kind of person whose mouth keeps things formal, pulls him aside and asks a question that is polite enough but carries an authority that makes the night's adrenaline ebb from him. "Did you act alone? Did anyone instruct you? What exactly did you do?" He answers again. He tells the truth as plainly as he can. That honesty is a quiet, stubborn thing. It does not exempt him from the processes that will come. Investigations, a review, possible temporary suspension from his route while the company assesses risks, but it keeps him inside the thing he intends. A man who tried, not for applause, but because looking away had never been an option. Night bleeds into morning, and the city shuffles its debris away. He thinks about going back to the cab and putting the photograph out for a long look. He thinks about his mother's hands and how they moved to catch small things. He thinks about the child and the way a tiny hand had clenched in his own. He feels the weight of being seen and of being answerable.
He walks back to his truck where a volunteer has left a damp blanket folded neatly on the passenger seat. Before he climbs in, he looks at the photograph in his wallet and presses his thumb to its corner like a small benediction. He slides the photo back into the fold and turns the key. The engine rumbles to life like a large creature waking. He sits with the steering wheel under his hands and the dashboard lights blinking him on, a small universe at his fingertips. And he knows in a way that is both quiet and enormous that the night will never entirely forget what happened. Neither will he. Somewhere in the morning's churn, his phone vibrates with a new sort of insistence, notifications proliferating, messages piling like small, urgent birds. He opens one and sees the shaky clip finally circulating in a shape he can no longer avoid. It is a truncated loop of him lifting the child out of the car. The sound is muffled. Rain, the whisper of someone's breath. A voice saying, "Hold him," in a way that sounds like both order and prayer. Under the clip, strangers' words bloom. Thanks, prayers, concerns. The quick snap of judgment from a few who see protocols as primary. He watches the clip once, then again. In the third pass, he notices a tiny detail he had not registered in the adrenaline. A woman in the background holding a small stuffed animal, shaking slightly as if through shock. A city of faces, 100 small reactions, holds more than any headline can ever contain. The clip is a fragment. It is also, impossibly, enough to ignite 1,000 conversations. He sits in the driver's seat and holds the phone in a way that feels less like possession and more like stewardship. He thinks of the way visibility is a kind of currency that people trade with different coins: praise, suspicion, support, investigation. He feels neither entitled to praise nor ashamed of attention. He feels the simple clarity of someone who has done a thing and now must live with the consequences. A soft knock comes at his window. The volunteer from earlier hands him a paper slip with a number. Someone offering lodging for the night, someone offering to drive to a hospital in the morning. A local organizer's contact who says, "We want to make sure people like you are not left alone when something like this happens. You did right," she says again, "but we won't let them make you alone."
He accepts the slip and folds it into the map pocket like one more small thing to carry. There is gratitude in the offer and a kind of communal muscle flexing that the night sometimes lacks, people showing up after the fact to weave a response that is kinder than the machinery of forms. He does not want to be at the center of a movement. He wants to stand aside and let the injured get well and life resume. But he also knows the shape of change. It is seldom sudden.
It is often the accretion of small acts, a fund here, an advice column there, a supervisor hearing an organizer's plea and thinking differently. He starts the rig and eases back onto the highway. The thermos is still in its place, and he takes a sip and allows the coffee to warm him. Rain has slowed into a persistent mist. The photograph in his wallet keeps the morning bright. He drives with a new sense of being observed, but not in a performance way, a quieter sense, like being marked by an event that has the power to rearrange how he moves through the world. As the miles gather, he thinks about the repair shop he had imagined years ago and how the nights now might open the possibility of something practical, a modest place where night workers could get help without the cost of daytime bureaucracy. He thinks about how visibility could be used for good, crowdfunding to pay a family's immediate needs, a local organizer pushing the company to consider formal protections for good faith bystanders, a community dinner to stitch together the stories that make the city hold. He knows the way the morning will morph into different demands. There will be calls from reporters, gentle and sharp, asking for statements to be used in pieces about civilian rescuers. There will be a call from a company lawyer, asking for details, a polite thing that will shift the night into the gray corridors of policy. There will be people offering kindness and people offering scrutiny. He will have to balance being honest with protecting the privacy of those involved, resisting the urge to narrate the child's injuries or the family's pain into sound bites. He keeps driving. The route unfolds under his tires, familiar and surprising in turns. The city during the day is a different animal. Its edges are sharper, its citizens hungrier for certainty. He will be asked to give a more detailed statement later. There will be a review. There may be a temporary hold on his runs while the company and authorities sort through liability concerns. No one promises absolution or punishment at this stage. It is the kind of limbo that comes with being seen. Documentation first, judgment much later, and a public's appetite for a tidy story in between. On the edge of town, a diner he once dreamt of stands like a small, humble temple, neon flickering, promise of strong coffee, and an unpretentious place to sit. The organizer who had offered help sends a short message. There are people talking. Not all of it is kind, but a few of us are talking to the company. We're trying to make sure things change so the next person who helps doesn't get punished. He looks at the message and breathes out in a way that feels like both relief and dread. Change often arrives with paperwork and meetings and endless polite negotiation, but it also arrives with a simple human truth. Someone saw, someone else moved, and others will now be asked to reckon with that small rupture. He thinks of his mother.
He imagines her sitting at the kitchen table, hands busy with a knitting needle or a broom, pausing to look out the window at a boy she had taught to see. He imagines her saying with equal parts scolding and pride, "You never were one for staying invisible when your hands were needed." He allows himself for a moment to feel the modest glow that comes with humility and action. He is not a saint. He is a man who noticed a child and moved. Maybe that is all any of us can be called to do. Notice, move, accept the consequences, and keep living. The road continues to unwind, and he keeps rolling along it, the photographed warning in his pocket like a small, secret light. As the highway stretches on, a stranger's phone at a roadside table uploads the shaky clip into the endless ocean of social media. It begins to ripple outward. Shares, comments, the fluttering excitement of something that feels like a miracle because it is small and messy and human. Notifications start to show up like a distant storm front on the horizon, some carrying thanks, some carrying questions, some carrying offers of support. He feels the first gusts of attention brush his face. He does not yet know how much they will alter his life. He only knows the shape of the night one more time. Rain, the child's small hand, his mother's folded photograph, the hum of diesel, and the thin, persistent fact that someone had chosen not to look away. He keeps driving, and the city breathes around him, reshaping itself slowly into a new morning. If stories like this matter to you, tap like. Morning insisted on itself in neat, ordinary ways. Dispatch calls arranged themselves into a list on his phone. A supervisor left a polite voicemail asking him to come in.
and a reporter's text, short, insistent, asked whether he'd be available for a quick comment. He did not want to make a spectacle of the night. He wanted the night's truth to be kept in its proper size, the child's small fingers curling around a blanket, the rain, the photo in his wallet. But the clip had opened him to other people's time. His phone vibrated like a small machine that would not stop. The company's safety director set up a meeting for later that day. The email language was careful. Review, policy, standard procedure. A lawyer's assistant called and asked for documentation. He understood why. He had spent his life inside systems that relied on paperwork and protocol to keep order. Those forms were how business did not dissolve into chaos. Still, it felt strange to find the night reframed into forms and checkboxes so soon after he'd been stumbling through wet asphalt and human breath. At the meeting, the room smelled of coffee and new carpet. The safety director's checklist was immaculate. Her voice was even. "We need to conduct a full incident review," she said. "Until then, we place you on administrative hold per company policy." The words landed like sanction brakes.
Administrative hold was an industry phrase that meant everything from paperwork delays to temporary loss of income. He had chilled, practical ways of managing such things, savings kept for a tire, occasional overtime, but the hold tightened the small economy of his life into a narrower shape. He nodded. He answered questions with the same plain honesty he'd used at the scene. He told them what he had seen and what he'd done. He said he had moved because there had been a child in immediate danger. He said he had been careful. He said he had no thought for glory. He kept his hands folded on the chair's arms so that his fingers would not betray his tiredness. Outside, the clip did its work. Pre-dawn social feeds are a strange weather of their own. Emotive bursts, quick sympathies, a rush of people who had never met him offering the smallest commodities, likes, shares, prayers. A crowdfunding page started by someone who had been moved to help collected donations quickly. It did not feel like charity to him. At first, it felt like an intrusion, a river of pennies thrown his way with the expectation that he would do something grand. He watched the totals climb on a borrowed phone until the numbers began to look less like a promise and more like a responsibility. Messages came from unexpected corners. A retired mechanic from 3 towns over offered to partner on the repair shop idea he had long shelved. A motel owner wrote to say he could offer discounted rooms for drivers who work nights. Small business owners sent notes offering free pastries for launch days. The local organizer, who had been quiet and efficient the night before, sent a line that felt like a lifeline. "We can make a plan so this helps more than one family." He did not want to be the center of an enterprise. He liked the anonymity of the road, but he had also held a child's small body in the rain, and the memory of that weight was an argument in itself. "If people want to help," he said to the organizer over a call, voice tight with the residual wobble of adrenaline, "I'd rather it help others like me than make a spectacle of what happened." They designed a plan without fanfare. The crowdfunding would seed a modest project, a late-night way station for night workers, coffee, a small mechanic's bench for quick fixes, a place to warm up, a bulletin board with ride shares and contact numbers. Not a shrine to him, not a monument, a practical place that echoed the small, stubborn care his mother had taught him. They wrote the project description in plain language and promised transparency. The organizer arranged a meeting with the company to discuss possible partnerships and liability concerns. The company responded with predictable caution. Their initial public statement was tempered, praise for the quick action, a reminder about safety protocols, and an assurance that the incident is under review. Corporate speech is a recipe of gratitude and distance. It offers warmth in public and a policy binder in private. The Transport Authority's spokesperson issued a generic line about threats on the roadway and importance of waiting for first responders, the kind of statement that tries to address safety without addressing the moral confusions that follow a citizen's intervention. Some commentators, columnists, and anonymous talk show callers returned to a familiar argument: good intentions are not a substitute for training. That tension took up a lot of space on the feeds. Sympathy and critique braided into the comments below the video. He read only a fraction of them, those that came from friends, neighbors, and the organizer's updates, and let the rest fall into the dull hum of headlines. He could feel, however, the pressure of being made into an idea: trucker hero, reckless citizen, symbol of a failing system. He was none of those things in full. He was a man who had chosen, in a wet, noisy moment, to pick a child up and move. The hospital, when it became a point in the story, became a small, dignified place of short conversations. Hospital privacy rules held like a polite fence. They kept him from being a participant in someone else's prognosis. A nurse, a friend of a friend, relayed simple facts through the organizer. The child was stable, family supported, transfer to a longer care facility not required at that point. No one offered absolutes. That was important. In his pocket, the photograph felt like a talisman and not a headline. Community momentum gathered in the form it always does when something moves people's hearts. A meeting at the diner down the street. The neighbor who ran the place, whose hands were as familiar with grease as his own, pulled a corner table aside and let organizers, company reps, and a handful of drivers sit and talk without the formality of a conference room. It smelled like fried onions and coffee. The organizer opened the conversation with a simple proposition. How can we make sure the next person who sees something like this is supported, not punished? The company's representative listened with a face trained into neutrality. The safety director was present. So was a member of the local council who happened to be at the diner for his own coffee. A retired EMS worker sat quietly, like someone who had watched these debates before. They spoke about training for night crews, about better communication between dispatchers and drivers, about a possible protocol that encouraged good faith reporting and immediate assistance from professionals trained to secure scenes. The organizer suggested a formal written pledge, nothing legalese heavy, but a public promise to review cases with nuance and to prioritize support for citizens who acted out of obvious need. It was small at first, a nod toward a policy that might become practice. What mattered more was the tone the meeting set.
It was not the company making a grand gesture. It was a conversation where those who lived the night and those who policed its rules sat across from one another with coffee cooling in front of them. They did not solve structural risk in an hour, but they began to remap their feelings about bystanders. They recognized that paperwork needed adjustment, so it would not be the only response to mess and courage. While those talks took shape, the community project gathered muscle. The crowdfunding reached a generous total, far more than he would have imagined, and organizers insisted on transparency. They set up a small board of local workers, the diner owner, the retired mechanic, and a representative from the organizer group to steward the funds. He was asked to be part of it, reluctantly, because he had been the catalyst. He accepted on the condition that his name not be front stage, that the place not carry his image as a banner. Call it what the community wants, he told them. Make it useful. They chose a little mid-block garage near a truck stop, a place with corrugated metal siding and 2 wide bays. It smelled of oil and spilled coffee. The first week it opened, the paint was still drying and someone had left a bouquet of cheap supermarket flowers on the counter. The sign, painted in a volunteer's careful hand, read something modest, Nightway Commons. Inside there were benches, a coffee urn, a small rack of donated clothes, phone chargers, and a corkboard full of phone numbers. A volunteer barber offered $5 haircuts 2 nights a week. A retired mechanic set up a bench for quick fixes and taught a short class on how to tighten a loose mirror without needing a full-day trip to a shop. The organizers group prepared a little ledger to keep track of services offered and donations used. He came less as a founder and more as a man who sometimes wore an apron handing out coffee. People who had read the feeds expected a figurehead to stand and cut a ribbon. He refused fanfare. The first day the place opened, the diner owner handed him a chipped mug and said simply, "We need you here." He took the mug and stood by the counter, pouring coffee for the first trucker who came through the door. The trucker, a woman who ran regional routes across 3 states, thanked him by name. "Not everyone would do what you did," she said. He shrugged and told her, "Lots of us see things." It felt right to let the place be what it was, a shared utilitarian kindness. Meanwhile, the public conversation continued to hum. A few critics demanded accountability. A few journalists sought a dramatic arc. He found interviews wearing. Sitting under lights that made his face look too honest, he kept returning to the same theme, seeing and choosing. He reminded interviewers that he had not meant to be an exemplar. He had meant to do the moral thing. It sounded small in sound bites.
It felt larger in the quiet moments, when he took the photograph from his wallet and thought of his mother's hands. There were harder moments. Administrative hold meant less income for a month. The company's policies required forms and depositions that ate at time. He had to choose between pressing for a faster administrative review and letting organizers do the talking. Some nights he slept poorly, replaying the arc of the accident and the smell of something hot on the air. He worried about how long the hold would last and what it meant for his steady route. Support from the community softened that worry. Groceries arrived on his porch anonymously. A neighbor left a grocery bag with staples and a note that said simply, "You did the right thing." The crowdfunding funds were allocated with prudence. A small stipend covered immediate bills and allowed him to breathe. The family whose child he had helped remained private, a decision supported by the organizers and the company. A single message arrived from them through the organizer, a thank you, A small video of a child's hand waving at the camera from under a blanket, the voice off-screen saying, "He's getting better, thanks to someone who stopped." He watched that clip in the kitchen at night, the light over the sink throwing his mug into shadow. The gratitude was simple and whole. He folded it into his pocket like the photograph. Months passed in the way small changes do, incrementally, stubbornly. The company published a revised guideline, a promise to review good faith interventions with a priority on support over punishment, an internal bulletin that encouraged employees to report their actions and assured them of a consultative process. It was not a legal shield. It did not promise immunity. It was, however, a shift in tone. Dispatchers received briefings about how to respond when drivers reported emergencies, a small procedural nudge that made it easier for a driver to say, "I stopped, here's what I saw," and for the company to offer immediate assistance rather than default to suspicion. Outside corporate corridors, municipal conversations crept forward. The Transport Authority convened a roundtable with organizers, drivers, and first responders to discuss safer collaboration between citizens and professionals. They spoke cautiously about balancing rapid response and training, about public education on how to be safer witnesses, and about system design that could better support those who intervened. Nothing was decreed overnight. Policy moves like an old vehicle, slow, resistant to sudden turns, but the talk itself mattered. It reframed the act of stopping from being merely risky to being socially legible. Public attention dimmed and flared with the seasons. New headlines arrived and old ones eased. He kept driving. He kept the photograph in the same place.
He visited Nightway Commons between runs, and sometimes spent an hour wiping tables or talking to a young driver about how to keep warm during winter miles. The place grew roots. A lawyer volunteered one evening to give a free consultation on driver rights. A retired nurse organized a short session on when to call for professional medical support. A mother who had lost a child years before came to give a talk on grief and community care that made everyone uncomfortable in the best possible way. One afternoon, weeks after the incident, he received a hand-delivered letter. It was from the child's family. No legal language, only careful, human words. They did not ask for anything. They wrote about the difficulty of that night and the quiet fact of having someone they did not know stand between danger and their child's small life. They invited him, if he wished, to come to a community gathering where they would say thank you in a private way. He hesitated. Being thanked in public had been complicated. Being thanked in private felt pure. He went. The gathering was small, held at a community center with folding chairs and a potluck table that smelled like home. A woman with an easy, sorrow-soft voice spoke about the ways small things keep people alive. A neighbor knocking at a door, a motorist slowing down, a mother who taught her child to hold a hand while crossing. She did not say his name loud. She did not make him the headline. She offered a folded card that contained inside the sketch of a child's palm and a brief note that said, "We will not forget you." He kept the card in his glove compartment for months afterwards, a paper talisman that did not demand he be anything other than human. There were moments when he wanted to step back further. The intrusion of cameras into places that had once been private felt like a breach. Not all attention was constructive. Some commentators demanded he be disciplined. Others wanted him to become a campaigner. He found the balance by returning to what he had always done: drive, notice what was in front of him, and do what he could. The energy he put into Nightway Commons felt like the right direction: quiet, practical, oriented to service rather than spectacle. One winter night, the company called him back from his hold. The incident review had been completed. Their language again was formal. No criminal charges. Administrative recommendations. Case closed pending follow-up. He listened, dampening the celebratory note that might have swelled in his chest. A hold released meant he could return to route, but it did not erase the months of paperwork and worry. It felt at best like a return to baseline. He was grateful and wary in equal measures. Back in the cab, the road welcomed him with its old familiar grammar. Headlights blinked and dashboards hummed. The thermos in its holder steamed. The leather of the wheel fit his palms, and the photograph in his wallet warmed under his thumb.
The nights were the same and different. He noticed lines of light where before they'd been just streaks. He noticed the way street lamps lit sleeping faces differently, now that he had been noticed in turn. He kept his head down and his heart open, the way his mother taught him. Nightway Commons solidified into a small institution of its own. The repair bench evolved into a volunteer-run service for minor emergencies. The board set up a small emergency fund that could be accessed quickly for immediate family needs. The company contributed a modest grant to support its operation, not as a public relations stunt, but as part of a new employee support initiative. Officials spoke in cautious tones about the need to protect good faith bystanders, and while laws remained complicated and layered, the culture around intervention had shifted a few degrees towards support. His visibility settled into a different shape. He still received messages, some grateful, some asking questions. He still avoided the loudest invites. But occasionally someone would approach him at a truck stop and say quietly, "Because of you, I stopped once." They would not ask for applause. They would say it like a confession and a relief. Those small conversations mattered more than headlines. Once, months after the crash, he sat alone in the Commons after everyone had gone home. The lights were dim, and the last client had taken the warmest chair by the heater. He pressed the photograph between his fingers and thought of his mother at her kitchen table, of her hands folding clothes and pressing coins into pockets. The place smelled of coffee grounds and motor oil and something like a future made practical. He felt a kind of peace that was not simple. An acceptance of the costs of being seen and the way recognition can become a lever for public good. He thought about the cost again, money lost during hold, time taken for interviews, the sleepless nights. He thought about the small victories. The child getting better. The diner offering an extra cup of coffee to a stranger. The company instituting supportive language. A driver learning to check on another driver without fear. The ledger of the Commons remained open and visible. They published monthly statements. People appreciated the transparency. He was proud of that modest accountability. A year after the night, the street where the crash had occurred was no different to the untrained eye. The same curve, the same floodlight, the same hum of distant freight. But a small sign had been placed near the guardrail, installed by the community, not as a marker of a single hero, but as a reminder. Look out for one another. It was weather-beaten and practical, the kind of sign that fit the city's unglamorous heart. He passed it one night as he rolled through, and his hands tightened on the wheel for a beat. Inside his wallet, the photograph felt warm. There were still moments of awkwardness.
Newscasters occasionally repackaged the old clip, and commentators would rehash the same argument, the balance between civic courage and trained response. He stopped reading the most toxic threats. He learned that being protective of the night was sometimes about limiting the publicness of the life he had lived. He found instead that the quieter tasks, pouring coffee, listening to a driver's long complaint about a broken mirror, teaching a volunteer how to balance a ledger, were the ones that made the most honest change. Once, during a cold shift, he found a young man leaning against the Commons counter, hands in his pockets, face pale from a night of too many miles. The young man confessed he had been the one to upload the original clip. He expected rebuke or a flattering question. Instead, he received a small, practical speech about responsibility, to be careful with the attention one can create, to protect the privacy of those hurt, and to use visibility to help. The young man listened with the embarrassed humility of someone who had wanted to make the world better and had not considered the complexity of doing so. They cleared a mug together. The young man later became one of the program's volunteers. On the anniversary of the crash, the Commons hosted a small potluck in a parking lot where drivers and community members gathered. No speeches, no cameras, just a folding table under a string of lights and food passed around. Someone brought chili, someone else made cornbread. A guitar broke into a simple song that half the crowd knew. He wrapped his hands around a warm paper cup and listened as the night spoke in its common language. Stories of missed exits and narrow tires, of mother's advice, and the constant humdrum courage of keeping engines running. The organizers set a moment of silence for those who had been through worse nights. A child at the edge of the crowd, no relation to the family from that rain-soaked night, ran in a circle and laughed like a small bell. He did not stand up to accept applause. He stood in the crowd and let the presence of people be thanks enough. When someone pressed a paper into his palm, a small hand-drawn card that read, "Thank you for noticing," he felt the paper like a small, strong thing. At the close of the night, as he walked back to his cab, the city stretched in low, patient lines, the hum of refrigeration trucks, the distant squeal of a train, the puddles reflecting sodium lamps. He slid into the driver's seat, the photograph warm under his thumb. He turned the key. The engine woke and the dash lit up like a small constellation. He pulled the radio low and let the hum of a traffic report fill the cab while his hands found the wheel. There was no grand ending, only the slow pulse of life continuing. He was still a man who drove a truck for a living, who lived by the patterns of routes and by small acts of care. He had been seen, he had been scrutinized, he had been asked to account for himself.
He had used what attention came his way for something concrete, a place that kept the city's night workers a little warmer, a little safer, a little less invisible. He thought of his mother one last time before he turned down the highway, her hands moving at the sink, her insistence that small repairs mattered. He thought of the child, the photograph, the coffee in paper cups, the sign by the guardrail, the Commons with its mismatched chairs. He did not imagine himself carved into a statue. He imagined instead a string of small acts stitched together, a cord that would hold while the city leaned on it. He drove on into the night, into rain that had become lighter, and into hours that would keep their own secrets. In his wallet, the photograph warmed beneath the calluses of his thumb. Behind him, the Commons closed for the night with a volunteer switching off the lights. Ahead, the road uncoiled like an old map, familiar and new at once. Share this story if it reminded you that ordinary people make extraordinary choices.